Before the world knew her as the Voice, Whitney Houston was just a little girl singing in a New Jersey church, her voice echoing through the walls like it carried the soul of the heavens themselves. Born into a world surrounded by music, Whitney was destined for greatness even before she understood what destiny meant. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was a renowned gospel singer who had performed with legends like Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley. Music was not just an art in the Houston household, it was oxygen. Whitney grew up watching her mother perform, learning the discipline behind the beauty, the sweat behind the applause. And yet, even as a child, there was something different about her, a rare sparkle, a presence that drew people in the moment she opened her mouth to sing. Whitney's early years were shaped by faith, family, and a fierce determination to find her voice in a world that didn't always open doors for young black women. At just 11, she began performing in her church choir, her angelic tone standing out so much that the congregation would often stop and listen in awe. Every note she sang seemed to come from a place deeper than her years, a sound that carried both innocence and divine power. It was in that small church that Whitney discovered her purpose, and even though the world outside was tough, inside that sanctuary she felt limitless. By her teenage years, Whitney was already modeling, breaking barriers as one of the first African-American women to appear on the cover of 17 magazine. But it was her voice, not her beauty, that would carve her path. When Clive Davis of Arista Records first heard her sing, he knew immediately that she was extraordinary. It wasn't just her range or control, it was the way her voice told stories, how it could make a listener feel every emotion she poured into a song. Davis signed her on the spot, igniting one of the greatest partnerships in music history. In 1985, the world changed forever with the release of Whitney Houston's self-titled debut album. Songs like Saving All My Love for You, How Will I Know, and Greatest Love of All weren't just hits, they were anthems of hope, strength, and pure emotion. Her debut became the best-selling first album by a female artist in history at that time, earning her multiple Grammys and making her a household name. Whitney had arrived, and she wasn't just a star, she was a revolution. She represented excellence, grace, and boundless talent. In a world where pop was dominated by men and where racial barriers still existed, Whitney broke through effortlessly, not with anger but with brilliance. What made her so powerful wasn't just her voice, it was her presence. When she performed, she didn't need dancers or pyrotechnics, her voice was enough. Every time she sang, she commanded the room, her sound pure, her control unmatched, her emotion undeniable. She could make a stadium feel like a church and a song feel like a prayer. By the early 1990s, Whitney Houston wasn't just famous, she was universal. Her name transcended continents, her songs echoed in homes, weddings, and celebrations across the globe. Every record she released became a symbol of hope and strength. But Whitney's magic wasn't just in her voice, it was in the way she made people feel. Her songs weren't merely melodies, they were messages. When she sang Greatest Love of All, people didn't just hear her, they heard themselves believing again. She had the rare ability to turn pain into power and music into meaning. Whitney's success after The Bodyguard became unimaginable. The soundtrack alone sold over 45 million copies worldwide, becoming one of the best-selling albums of all time. And that iconic song, I Will Always Love You, became an anthem of eternal love, heartbreak, and strength, one that continues to move hearts even decades later. It wasn't just her voice, it was her storytelling. Every note she hit carried emotion so raw that it felt like a conversation between souls. She didn't perform songs, she became them. At this point, Whitney was not only the world's top female vocalist but also a symbol of black excellence, beauty, and empowerment. Her presence on stage radiated royalty. Her poise, her smile, her effortless confidence, it all told a story of a woman who had fought for her place and earned it with grace. Little girls looked up to her, seeing not just a singer but a representation of possibility. Whitney was proof that you could come from humble beginnings, fight the odds, and still rise to the highest peaks of human achievement. But with every peak comes pressure. The music industry is a place of glitter and shadows, and Whitney found herself caught between the two. The demands were endless: more hits, more tours, more appearances. Perfection became expected. Every time she walked into a studio, the world wanted magic. But magic, even for someone like Whitney, came with a price. She was a woman who had given everything to her art, her voice, her time, her soul. And slowly, the weight of that expectation began to take its toll. Behind the scenes, Whitney was navigating personal struggles. The tabloids feasted on rumors and controversies, often forgetting that behind the superstar was a woman who felt deeply, who loved fiercely, and who was human like everyone else. Her marriage to Bobby Brown, while passionate, also brought turbulence. The media focused on the chaos but ignored the complexity, the love, the loyalty, and the pain of two people trying to navigate fame and normalcy simultaneously. Whitney was constantly fighting to balance her personal life with her career, her private identity with her public image. And yet, through it all, she kept giving. Her performances continued to leave audiences breathless. Even when people speculated that she was struggling, she still showed up, still sang, still connected. As the 2010s approached, the world was changing rapidly, but Whitney Houston remained a name that commanded reverence. Even after years of public scrutiny, she carried herself with an aura of grace that could not be diminished. Whenever she appeared on stage, no matter how fragile the moment, the audience could feel that same electricity, the same divine connection that had once made her unstoppable. There was always that spark, that unshakable reminder of who she truly was, a woman born to sing, to feel, and to move hearts. People often said that Whitney's voice was a gift from God, but what they sometimes overlooked was how much work went into that gift. Whitney had spent years perfecting her craft, hours in studios, endless rehearsals, vocal exercises that stretched her endurance. Her voice wasn't just natural talent, it was also discipline, effort, and an unrelenting drive to honor the music she loved. Even in moments when her voice grew tired, her soul never did. That's what made her performances so unforgettable. You didn't just hear her sing, you felt her live inside every note. Behind the glamour, Whitney longed for the peace that had once been so easy to find in her mother's church. Fame had given her everything and taken just as much. But she never allowed bitterness to define her. Instead, she often spoke about gratitude, about being thankful for the love of her fans, for the opportunity to share her gift, for the lessons that life had forced her to learn. Those who met her in person often described her as soft-spoken, humble, even shy. She had the kind of presence that filled a room not because she demanded attention, but because her energy was radiant, kind, and genuine. Her daughter, Bobby Christina, became the center of Whitney's world. She wanted to be the kind of mother who could pass on not just success but also strength, the understanding that no matter how dark life gets, there's always a light that never goes out. She often said that her greatest joy was hearing her daughter laugh, seeing her grow, and knowing that her music had built a better future for her. But being both a global superstar and a mother was never easy. Whitney had to balance the world's expectations with her own dreams of simplicity, and that tug-of-war defined much of her later life. When Whitney prepared for her comeback with I Look to You, it wasn't about reclaiming fame, it was about reclaiming herself. That album was her prayer, her confession, her resurrection. The title track spoke of surrender and renewal, and when she sang it live, tears would often roll down the faces of her fans. It was as if she was speaking to every person who had ever stumbled and still found the courage to rise again. The world saw that Whitney's story wasn't just about a voice, it was about faith, humanity, and redemption. Even in her final years, Whitney's presence inspired awe. Every appearance, every interview, every smile reminded people of the magic she carried. There comes a time in every legend's life when even the brightest lights begin to flicker, not because the flame has lost its power, but because the world around it has grown too noisy to appreciate its warmth. For Whitney Houston, that noise was deafening: fame, expectation, judgment, whispers from people who loved her one moment and doubted her the next. But deep inside her heart, there was still that same young girl from Newark, New Jersey, who sang not for applause but for connection. When the world seemed ready to move on, Whitney decided she would not let her legacy fade into headlines or rumors. She would rise again, not as the fragile superstar, but as the woman who had learned what it truly meant to fall, to heal, and to believe. After years of soul-searching and isolation, she began to rebuild quietly, away from cameras, away from the pressure, just her voice, her faith, and her reflection in the mirror. She looked at herself one morning and said, "I'm still here." And that realization, that she was still standing, was more powerful than any award or chart-topping single she had ever earned. It was her rebirth. She began performing again, cautiously at first, testing her strength like a phoenix stretching its wings after the storm. The voice that once soared effortlessly now carried something deeper, not perfection, but truth. Every note had a story, every pause a wound, every breath a triumph. Fans could feel it. It wasn't the same Whitney from the 80s, it was a woman who had lived through darkness and emerged with wisdom. The applause that followed her comeback was not just for her music, it was for her courage. It reminded the world that greatness is not about never falling, but about how many times you rise after you do. The industry watched in awe as she stepped back into the light, not chasing fame, but reclaiming her dignity, her artistry, and her faith in herself. That, right there, was the real miracle. She recorded again, reconnected with audiences, and reminded everyone why she had been called the Voice. But this time, it wasn't about proving herself, it was about expressing herself. There was a grace in her presence, a humility that came only from experience. When she looked at her fans, she didn't just see a crowd, she saw people who had walked with her through the highs and lows, who had never given up on her spirit. And in return, she gave them the most honest version of herself. Her late career performances weren't about hitting the highest note anymore, they were about touching the deepest heart. Each song became a prayer, a confession, a celebration of survival. Behind the scenes, Whitney poured her heart into mentoring young artists, teaching them not only how to sing but how to stay grounded.